Well, grace to you and peace from God our Father and from our Lord Jesus Christ. The wine gave out. Ugh. That's how I feel, and I'm guessing most of us feel, when anything gives out. The gas in your tank, your energy, your compassion, your bank account, the relationship, your patience with your children. No one wants what they need and value. No wonder there was all that panic buying of TP at the beginning of the pandemic. And now with all the shipping snafus, it's happening again. People are buying up holiday gifts and decorations and evidently paint and a whole bunch of other things. Running out of wine might not seem like a very big deal, but in this story, they are at one of life's most important celebrations. And in Jesus' time, this was something that families would save up for years and years and years. And when the time came, everybody in the community would be invited, and it would go on for days, which seems hard to imagine, but I was able, when I did my internship in Singapore, to see how that was the custom there for both weddings and for funerals. Days-long celebrations. So, when the wine gave out at this wedding, it brought all the joy to a screeching halt. And the bride and groom's families had to watch the guests roll their eyes and overhear them whisper to each other, "Wow, how did they let that happen?" Then Jesus transforms water, common as dirt, into wine so impressive, the wine steward thinks there's been a mistake, and it should have been served when people were sober enough to appreciate it. Plus, not only is it delicious, there are vats and vats and vats of it. More than enough for everybody. Well, what does wine to keep the celebration going have to do with reforming the church, either in the 16th century or today? Well, those huge vats of transformed water are a sign, Jesus' first sign and miracle, that point us to God's grace. How does such a thing point us to God? Well, abundance. Well, generosity. Taking what's ordinary and transforming it into something extraordinary. This is what God does. Always does, if we have eyes to see it. Grace, endless as those vats of wine, is what Martin Luther dared to stake his life on, literally. And we as Lutherans dare to stake our faith, and as we live out our faith, our lives also, on God's gracious abundance, generosity, and ability to take what we have and make it something far more than we can imagine. I think it's really tempting, and I speak for myself here, it's really tempting to worry about what could give out, to look at our lives and get fixated on that, where there might not be enough, where we might not be enough. And friends, when we focus on that, we start running the numbers, and worry gets the upper hand. And then, before we know it, we're coming up with all kinds of frightening scenarios. But in God's economy of grace, that line of worried reasoning is always proven wrong. All the stories, the 5 loaves and 2 fish that feed 5,000, the smallest seed of faith that becomes a shrub, the greatest shrub, providing shelter and shade. The last handful of grain that feeds a mother and her child for months. On and on, again and again, what we learn is that God provides abundantly. But it's tough to make that transition. There's an old saying that you can't outgive God. You ever heard that one? You can't outgive God. If God has ever called you to give more than you thought you could, then I'm guessing that in your giving of what you felt called to give, your attention transformed your worry into a fresh awareness of how abundantly blessed you are with all the things that matter most to you. And in ways you could never have imagined, God provided for you. There's an interesting fact when you run the numbers on how people give. The people on the lowest rungs of the economic ladder give a far higher percent of their income than those in the middle to the top. Maybe they're already living dependent on God. Maybe they already know the importance and the joy of sharing and giving and receiving. Because you know what? That's just what always happens when we give. Needs are met. Joy is shared. Anxiety diminishes. Blessings flow. How? I can't say. All I can say is that it does happen that way. Which is why, on this Reformation Sunday, I'm thinking that possibly we could lean into a reforming of the default way that we tend to think about generosity, right? Betsy McGregor shared in our last church council, just kind of spontaneously, how her understanding of generosity has undergone a change recently. So I asked her if she'd be willing to tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you. And I have to admit that it must have been pretty profound because I don't exactly remember what I said, but I can tell you that I remembered some things about some meetings I have been in about the campaign, and it was something particular that Pastor Kathy said, and it was about sacrifice. And sacrifice is different for me this year, and maybe for some of you than it has been in the past, but also generosity is different. Because for the first time when I thought about my pledge, it wasn't just about making the pledge, it was about all the things I get from this community, and one of the ways I can support that is through my pledge. And it didn't feel like a sacrifice to me as much as it's a reciprocal relationship, I guess would be the way I would put it. And in order for that relationship to stay balanced, I have to support it in many ways, and I do that not just financially, but through volunteering, and some of you know I play the piano every Sunday. But the bottom line is that it didn't feel sacrificial because I really feel like I get so much back from this community, and I never realized how much I got back from this community until we weren't meeting together. And since we've been back in this wonderful room, it's made it so much more tangible for me, but also it's helped me realize how much I missed all of you, and to be able to participate fully in our campaign is something I see as I'm grateful for. I'm really grateful for. And so, like I said, I'm not exactly sure what I said, but I think I hit the highlights. So.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you, Betsy. Appreciate that. Well, I think the kind of default understanding of generosity would be something like this, that generosity is for wealthy people, that they give money and they give when certain thresholds are met. And in our culture, generally, the priorities tend to be spending, saving, giving. I believe that's in line with the way of living that tends to be about running the numbers. It's in line with the way of living where generosity is a particular act that we might undertake at a certain time for a certain purpose. But in the Bible, friends, generosity is for everyone. Everyone. We see the widow giving her 2 cents. We see Zacchaeus giving half of what he has. Generosity is for everyone. And in the Bible, generosity isn't just what we give, it's the way we live. It's what we do every day. It's how we give of ourselves. And what that does is it changes those priorities. It turns them upside down. Giving daily becomes our top priority. Saving and then spending. We do it not so much to respond to a particular ask, but we do it because our lives are about blessing other people with God's love. I love the passages for today's worship. Exodus, which Niels read so well, is the first capital campaign. Did you notice that? And 2 Corinthians, that wonderful passage from Paul, was really kind of the first giving campaign. Those people that Paul holds up as a bit of an example are a great illustration of this newer, reformed form of generosity. People who gave, listen to these words, out of their extreme poverty and joy. And as they gave, they overflowed in a wealth of generosity. That's pretty cool. And then, of course, there are those endless vats of wine, seemingly out of nowhere, a sign of God's abundant and always present grace when we're sure that what we need has given out. It's a blessing. It's a true blessing, friends, that we together are as one congregation. I feel like this undertaking, this vision-aligned building, and the things that are already taking place in it that weren't possible before, that they're a bit like the barn raisings or the church raisings that used to take place in the prairies, right? Where people would come from all over and all together erect this sign of God's presence. I think Ballard and this community also need this sign, our sign of God's presence. of God's generosity, of God's abundance, and of God's grace in this anxious, hyper, bound up world that we live in, where the joys and blessings are still so abundant, even so. So I invite you to see if perhaps, and maybe you already are about this, and it's just me who's still working on it, but to let God transform our worry into an act of faith that ultimately turns that worry into joy. We're blessed to have our last Opening Doors video, and it is a focus on generosity, and we thank Tamara Anderson for it.
There's much to appreciate about our Redeemers. And certainly this church has seen me through divorce and job loss and has supported me beyond measure. When I think about that, it's mind-blowing. I would say not a day goes by where I don't feel thankful for my well-being. And again, that dutiful nature or that reciprocal nature, I have a duty to help others towards their well-being, and I know this church does that. It's been demonstrated time and time and time again. So it's kind of cool to be a part of that. And I love what the space, how the space has become. I appreciate the openness, you know, the intentionality of opening the space to make it more visible and open to passersby. When we had our first choir rehearsal, it was really nice to be back. And it was getting dark. And I was happy that we were singing together. But I was also happy that the lights were on and that people driving by would see that. And I felt like that was a gift, just having the lights on and having people in here and us doing what we do, which is sing and do that well. But it kind of made me think of being a kid and outside playing, and it starts getting dark. The lights are on and you see in people's houses and it feels good. I thought we were offering that in that rehearsal. I want to say thank you.
Here's where we depart a bit from our usual service order. As Pastor Gretchen leads us in a calling song, you're all invited, probably most importantly, to take a moment of prayer and perhaps ask God what God is calling you to offer. And then if you would come forward and place your pledge in the red basket, that would be great. So let's take a moment to pray. Generous, gracious, loving God, we cannot outgive you. And we know this. We see it in your Son, Jesus Christ, in his life, in his death, in his resurrection, all to show us that we can live fully and abundantly and freely. As we offer our pledges and gifts to you, we pray not only that it would support our congregation's mission, but that perhaps we might be transformed a bit in the giving, that the water of our lives would become wine of celebration and joy and justice, shared and offered to so many others. In your name, we ask. Amen.